There are certainly people that are durable, that can bounce reps and bang their head against the wall and they're fine. And if you're one of those people that can do that, if you've been benching 3 days a week for the last 10 years and you have no issues, there's no reason for you not to do it. But just remember that there's more than one way to skin a cat. My early training was defined by bench pressing. Like so many other people, I would just do what my friends did. And that involved benching basically 5 days a week. Now, a typical bench workout involved us climbing under a loaded barbell, usually that had the same weight that the guy before us was using, because of course, why would you change the weight to accommodate your own physical capabilities? And we would take it out of the rack with the help of a spotter, where we would proceed to let it free fall to our chest. Now, once it was firmly planted into our sternum, we would twist and kick and heave and spit to try to get this weight off our chest, and eventually we'd be successful, usually with the help of a spotter and maybe a couple of other people. Oddly enough, that was enough to get us strong in the beginning. When you're a teenager, you're super resilient and you can just bounce against a brick wall, and usually that's enough to cause some type of strength gains. And then that teaches you a whole bunch of bad habits where you gotta walk around thinking like you figured out how to work out, but really you're just being kind of dumb. Anyways, when I think of all of the lessons I've learned about training, especially what not to do, most of those lessons came from benching. And I developed a hatred of benching over the years, and I want to talk to you guys about that. Now, I've said before, when I was younger, I had a very misguided sense. I over-romanticized what strength could do for you. Now, don't get me wrong, strength is extraordinarily important in just about anything you can do in life. But by itself, it's not really that valuable. In fact, by itself, it can almost be worse than just being generally out of shape. Somebody who is completely untrained can't very well give themselves rhabdo by pushing it too hard. But if you take a relatively muscled lifter and throw them into a CrossFit workout, they can dig themselves into a recovery hole that can actually cause serious health problems. So strength is important, but you need the coordination and fitness and other things to really get something out of it. Well, beyond that, I over-romanticize the role of the bench press as being a proxy for strength. So I would obsess over getting my bench better, over getting those numbers better. I thought benching just did more than it does. And that was a big piece of the letdown when I realized that all of that work didn't really pay off quite the way I thought it would. And guys, do me a favor, if you found any of this helpful, entertaining, educational, please consider hitting the subscribe button. The growth of this channel is entirely because of you, and I greatly appreciate it. So let's start with this conversation from the most surface level position, which is asking a simple question like, should you bench or not? Is benching good or bad? Is it worth it? And if we do that, we can start with just a basic simple list of pros and cons. And then as we get into it, we can find the exceptions to the rules, add a little bit of nuance to when it's appropriate, when it's not. The pros, the first one, biggest one, a lot of cultural significance in the bench press, and that's what pushes a lot of people to do it. Now, you might think of that as a negative because it's a draw to do it that doesn't really make you better, and that's true. But if you are going to be strong, one of the benefits is being physically capable in a way that turns heads, that gets attention, that's relevant to what all the other strong people are doing. Whether you think that's valuable or not, it is. Think of NFL players that have to bench press for the combine. The bench press says absolutely nothing about how you're going to perform as a wide receiver or as a running back, yet it's used as something that people strive for. So to get that clout and recognition and stand out in that competitive environment, you got to bench press. So that's actually one of the reasons I kept it in for so long, is because it's relevant to what I'm doing. And if I want people to take me seriously, I have to be able to bench press my way out of a paper bag. It's not too much to ask. So the fact is that there is cultural significance, and that's not necessarily a negative. Now, number two is it's a sport. Of course you're going to bench press if you're a power lifter, because that is 1/3 of powerlifting. So if you are specifically oriented towards developing strength on a platform so that you can compete against other strong people, you need to know how to bench press. And then third, upper body overload. This is the biggest argument for physical development that the bench press has with it. You can talk about isolation. Does it isolate the pecs? Does it grow the pecs? People will get into that. If you go from 100 pounds to 400 pounds in your bench press, your pecs have likely gotten much, much bigger. But the degree to which they're gonna grow is gonna be different from person to person. If you're just really hyper-focused on hypertrophy or sculpting the perfect body, you're gonna be experimenting with different angles, different exercises anyways, so it's not all gonna fall on bench pressing. But there is a very good upper body development benefit from it. If all you have is a little bit of time to do a few movements, this is one of those big movements that does quite a bit. It allows you also to handle a lot more weight than you do in the overhead press. So even someone like Ripito, who thinks the bench press is really overrated, still puts it in the training for that benefit, because it allows you to handle more weight than you did if you were just overhead pressing. So the benefit is the pecs, the delts, the triceps, they handle more load, nervous system becomes better conditioned to producing force, and that's something that should translate to your overhead pressing, especially if you do the two at the same time. Now here are the cons. Here's the weeds we get into when we start picking it apart. First of all, yes, there's cultural significance, but that means it's a muggle exercise. Everybody does it, and everybody does it with little reason to do it. Now, I know this doesn't have anything to do with development. It just offends my elitist sensibilities. But the fact that the bench press doesn't produce in proportion to how popular it is makes the fact that it is like the culturally accepted benchmark for how strong you are really, really annoying. Now, to sidestep that, you should be very clear with what your goals are, and you should find a specific avenue for getting to those goals that is deliberate. So you can take a bench press and make it more specialized to you and what you want to do by either eliminating it or tweaking it. If you're a powerlifter, you're going to practice a technique that allows you to move the most amount of weight, and that's going to be less normie. It's going to be more specialized. Similarly, if you're a bodybuilder, you're going to do a lot of different angles, a lot of different ranges of motion, and you're not really going to focus on the load as much as you're going to be focused on the end result, which is how fatigued you get, how much damage gets caused to the muscles, how significant was it to cause this local growth where you wanted it. You can do pulse reps where you don't lock out or touch your chest. You can do drop sets. You can do 21s. You can do guillotine presses where you take the bar to your neck. And that will have a more specialized effect than just laying around and heaving a bunch of weight off your sternum like it was a trampoline. Now, while bench pressing is part of a sport of powerlifting, the bench pressing is not functional whatsoever. So all of the other sports that utilize strength training to set their athletes up for success, they end up over-representing bench pressing in their training. And this leads a lot of people to think that benching actually has something to do with your ability to perform on the field, and it almost never does. Now, when you're talking about functionality and specificity with sport, the point of lifting is not to best mimic what you do in the sport, but the developmental movements you do have to have some transfer. You have to be able to take the strength you get from a squat and apply it to an athlete who has to run on a football field. I remember when I went out to play ball in junior college, there were guys that would talk about bench pressing strength as hitting pressure. As in, if I bench 400 pounds, that's 400 pounds of hitting pressure. Now, of course, you have to be completely ignorant of biomechanics and basic physics, but you can't really fault people, because as much as a bench press pops up, as much as it was a test, it makes sense why people would mistake it as being really relevant to what they do. But it's really not. It's a secondary movement of a secondary mode of training. The only real reason it would be mandatory to do is if you actually compete in powerlifting. Beyond that, there are substitutions, there are other exercises. Bench pressing is not the best or only way. That doesn't mean there isn't value, but it is not necessarily the best way. It's not mandatory. There are bodybuilders who don't bench press. There are strongmen who don't bench press. There are athletes who don't bench press. So when you're weighing out the cost versus the reward, take that into account. Do you have to do this thing if it's causing you issues in order to get this end result? And for most people, usually the answer is no. And then number 3 is Snap City. It's getting those injuries, those overuse issues. I've had dozens in both of my shoulders over the years. This is one of the reasons I have a hatred of benching, is because it always makes me feel like crap. I start to get good. I find a frequency and amount of work that gets me stronger. And a couple weeks in, all of a sudden my joints hurt. If I take a deload, I detrain, my joints still hurt a little bit. If I don't take a deload, I can push through for a little bit, but then it becomes excruciating. And I've had it everywhere. I've had rotator cuff issues. I've had labrum tears. And it's possible you can track that back to improper benching technique, whatever that means. But there's no real reason to believe that if everybody retracts their shoulder blades when they bench, they're going to be pain-free, or if everybody does their face pulls, they're going to be pain-free. You can talk about people who are experiencing those as using these methods as a way to try to come back, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else is going to be able to bench press without any ill effects. No matter what you prescribe, if you have a big population of people and they're all benching, it's just the way it is. A certain percentage of them are going to get bicep tendonitis, they're going to get labrum issues, they're going to get overuse issues. So you really have to weigh out how durable you are, how important this is to your goals, and if it's really important to your goals, what's your capacity to temper yourself to it and make yourself resilient to it. And there are some workarounds. Now, given all of these, I still have a love for bench press that goes along with my hatred because I was able to find some meaningful uses for it that solve specific problems. And I'm always preaching this. Don't get around and just start moving things around like a kid in a sandbox because you can. When you're trying to make changes to your training, they have to be deliberate, they have to be specific. So get in mind what problem you're trying to solve. What are you trying to get out of this maneuver? And then put this change into play and see how it turns out. For me specifically, I didn't bench for a lot of years because I heard strong men don't bench, and I just overhead pressed. Overhead press got extraordinarily good, but my upper body was relatively undeveloped, which meant that not only could I not do other things that required my chest, like I couldn't pinch sandbags or Atlas stones very well, but I also wasn't good on certain overhead pressing events that required a little bit of extra strength. Once I started benching and got my bench up to a reasonable level, all of a sudden I was exponentially better at all of these things that I was having trouble with earlier on. Now, of course, there's other things I probably could have done. I know there are people that do more dedicated bag and stone work to get those muscles stronger. That's viable. I know people that do chest flies and pec deck in order to get their pinching strength stronger. There are always workarounds. My default recommendation for most people is that the bench press is a staple so that you can utilize the overload benefit, so that you can maintain the cultural significance. And if you ever decide to do a powerlifting meet, you're not starting from scratch. But I think most people are best off with the bench press being a secondary exercise. Even if you consider it your main lift for whatever upper body workout you're about to do, I feel like the emphasis shouldn't be on handling as much weight as you can. It should be on finding the most comfortable, natural groove and tempering yourself to that as much as possible. That means a lot more control. That means a lot more pausing, a lot more playing around with what your posterior is doing. Are your shoulder blades retracted? Are you maintaining stability throughout the entire range of motion? There are certainly people that are durable, that can bounce reps and bang their head against the wall, and they're fine. And if you're one of those people that can do that, if you've been benching 3 days a week for the last 10 years and you have no issues, there's no reason for you not to do it. But just remember that there's more than one way to skin a cat. It's for those people that have that cost associated with it, that they have to think very carefully about what they're trying to get out of training. If hypothetically barbell bench presses were off the table, the vast majority of you would be just fine switching to dumbbells, machines, or even body weight movements. And this is a really important thing to know, is how to progress without hyper fixating on chasing weight. Because if you can do that, that means you can train and progress no matter what your body's doing. If you depend on that consistent overload to get stronger, once you get sidelined, once you get injured, you're not going to know what to do. You're going to sit on the couch in atrophy and you're going to end up back at square one. So learn how to experiment with exercises, learn how to find movements that don't hurt, learn how to apply things like tempo and changes to the way the reps are done. You can see the last video I did talking about reps and the differences between them. You can make changes to work around issues so you can keep the weight down and still progress. And eventually, if you do that with a bench press, you're going to temper yourself to that disadvantaged position. Your shoulders will be stronger, your tendons will be thicker, you'll be more resistant to inflammation, injury, and all of the other problems that typically plague people with this movement. So that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.